Hello, welcome to Early Church History. I look forward to meeting all of you soon when our weekend course convenes at the end of January. In the meantime, I want to introduce myself and introduce the course. So I'm Dr. Kimberly Baker. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to give you some key information from the syllabus and the reading guide. So here's a little bit about myself. I'm an associate professor of church history here at St. Myron. This is my 8th year on the faculty. If you're interested in what I do when I'm not teaching courses, my research interest is Augustine. I'm an Augustine scholar, and I focus primarily on his preaching, especially his preaching about the life of the church as the body of Christ. I'm very interested in what he has to say about how our understanding of ourselves as the body of Christ shapes our life in the world, our Christian way of life. I did my doctoral studies at the University of Notre Dame, and before coming to St. Myron, I taught for 4 years at St. Vincent College, which is a Benedictine college in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. So now let's turn to some details of the course. What I want to do is go over key information on the syllabus and the reading guide, and then at the very end of this video, I'll do some introduction, a little bit about kind of the makeup of the Roman Empire. And so there'll be a couple of places where I'll say this: if you need a pause, this would be a good place to pause, or here are the materials you'll need, and this would be a good time to go and get them. So I'll give you some markers as we go. So for example, right now, for talking about the details of the course, I'm going to talk about the syllabus, which you can find on our Moodle page, and then also I'll make a reference to the reading guide for our first weekend. And so take a moment to find those documents, open them up on Moodle or print them out, whatever works for you, and this will be my time to explain how this course is set up. So if you need a pause, this would be a good place to put the pause and go and find your documents. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the syllabus. I'll just hit highlights, and then what I would ask you to do is read through the syllabus before the first day of class, and that'll be one of the very first things we do when we meet in January, is to talk about the makeup of the course, what's expected, and to be sure all that's clear before we move forward. So at the top of the syllabus, you find my contact information, my email, my office phone number, as well as the information about our classroom. It's all right there at the very, very top. You have the course description. I'm not going to read through that, but it gives you some sense of what the course is about. I want to talk about the required text for the course. All of these are available for purchase through the Scholar Shop, along with a packet of course materials. So you have a variety of books. The first book is The Early Church by Henry Chadwick. This book gives a survey of the history of the church in the first few centuries. We're going to use this course, this book, as our kind of background reading, giving us the backdrop of the historical viewpoint, helping us to learn about people, events, and other developments. Next on the list is Early Christian Fathers, translated by Cyril Richardson. This book includes translations of texts that were written in the early church time period. So these would be the primary sources, the sources that come from the time period studied. And reading these texts will give us a first-hand account from the early Christians themselves. We'll be hearing their voices speak, hearing from their perspective. Richardson also includes background material for these texts, and so those would be secondary sources. Those would be the scholarly texts that analyze the primary sources. So you find some introductions that Richardson has written for each of the texts in here. So that's kind of two of the key books that we'll have, especially for this first weekend. Another book we have is Augustine's Confessions. We'll read most of the book. We're not going to read everything. We'll read most of the book in the third weekend. I've chosen this particular edition for a couple of reasons. First, it's an excellent translation. Maria Bolding did the translation. She died a few years ago. She was a British Benedictine woman, and later in her life she lived more as a hermit, and a lot of what she did was scholarship and translation work. And she did this translation of Confessions. It's a beautiful translation, very readable and engaging, while also remaining faithful to the essence of Augustine's Latin writing. It's also easier in class if we all read from the same translation, so I've chosen this pocket edition, which is relatively inexpensive, and so hopefully that makes it manageable for everybody to have the same edition. Often students will ask if they're required to buy this translation or if they can use one they already have. There are a lot of very good translations of Confessions out there, so it's not that this is the only one. I don't forbid you to use another translation, but I strongly encourage you to use this one. Partly, I think you'll enjoy this particular translation, and it does make it easier for us. Now, if you want a translation or you want an edition with more footnotes and different kind of study aids there is a translation, a different edition of the same translation by Maria Bolding in this series from New City Press, and you might consider that study edition rather than the pocket edition. You should be able to find that online through the New City Press website. I don't think we have that one in the Scholar Shop. The one that they've ordered for the course will be this pocket edition. So I encourage you to give that one a look. A couple of other things that are available. One is a course packet. I'm leaning over to get my materials. So you'll find a course packet. It'll just be in a manila envelope like this. And it's available through the Scholar Shop and only through the Scholar Shop. The reason we have this course packet, there are many texts that I would like for us to read for this course. And a lot of times it'll just be like one selection from this book and one selection from that book. And so it doesn't make sense for you to have to buy a lot of additional books to only use one selection or one chapter from that book. So what I've done is collected those readings together into the packet. But they're materials that are under copyright protection, which means I can't just distribute those. I can't just, certainly not sell them to you. So what we've done is pay fees to the publishers to have permission to copy the selections that we want and to put them together in the packet. So the cost of the packet covers the cost of those fees to ensure that publishers and authors and translators receive just wage for the work that they've done. And then it also will cover some of the fee of the photocopying as well. So sometimes students will ask, well, why didn't you just put them on Moodle? That would have saved us a lot of money. But because these are materials that are copyrighted, I still would have been obligated by law to collect those permission fees, even if we did that. And so we have found this is a more streamlined process to handle the materials, to put them together in a packet, and then that way you have them all right there together. I think it's always good to have a Bible on hand when reading theological texts, so I encourage you to have a copy nearby as you're preparing. And in class, we won't do we certainly won't be doing like full Bible study, but sometimes in class, a conversation leads to some question about the Bible, and we can look it up if we have our Bibles right there with us. Or we'll see a reference that one of our texts will have, and we can look up that reference. And again, any translation is fine. Then there's one more text that's on the list that's truly optional. And that would be this one, the Collegeville Church History Timeline. Some students have found this to be a useful resource. It has kind of a one-page summary of key events for each century of the church history, and then also a really nice timeline here in the center of the book that puts church text, church events in line with kind of the greater kind of imperial and what we might think of as secular history that's taking place, the temporal history that's taking place at the same time. So some students have found it helpful. It's not required. We're not going to actively use this in the course, but I've asked the Scholar Shop to have it available with our course materials for those of you who would like to buy it for your own use. So that's the course materials. Now let's talk a little bit about the assignments. If you go through the syllabus, you'll see I give just a brief description of the types of assignments that we'll have, the grading policies. Once we get in the class and actually have assignments going that you'll be getting a grade for, we'll talk about the expectations for each assignment, but that lets you know the layout of the course. I have a section here about academic integrity. Please be sure to read that. If you have any questions about what would constitute honesty or dishonesty in academic work, I certainly would want to have that conversation with you. I'm happy to answer your questions. I have a brief mention about using technology responsibly in class, and then some questions to ask of a historical text. Let's turn over to page 4 and look at the course schedule and assigned readings. You'll see that what I've done on the syllabus is outline our topics and the reading for each weekend session. And I want to be sure you're clear on how the different categories are set up. So, for example, our first weekend, we're really looking at Christianity in Roman context, looking at how it develops in context, what are some of the parts of Roman culture, Roman history that are shaping things in the church, where there are points of conflict between church and culture. So I've outlined what we'll do for each session, whether it be the Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon. And for the most part, we'll be able to keep this rhythm of this pace of the course. There's certain selections that I know often we won't quite finish before lunch, and so we'll pick back up after lunch. But for the most part, this lets you know the outline of the course, and we should be able to stick pretty closely to it. You'll see italics, and those are kind of the subtopics. So for example, introductions will be the first thing we do. Then in italics, you see early Christianity in Jewish and Roman context. That's the topic for this next section of readings. And then where you have this indented section that's not italics, just in kind of regular font there, those are the reading assignments that you would complete before that first weekend. So Noble et al., Noble and others, Western Civilization. When you see this CP, that's your signal that it's in the course packet. And so when you get your course packet, you'll look in there and you'll see that there is this text. It says Imperial Rome, and over in the corner, hopefully it's copied, okay, in your copy you'll see Noble, Thomas, and the information about the book. That's this particular chapter from this Western Civilization book that you would read before class. Chadwick, that would be the book by Henry Chadwick, Early Church. If you see Richardson, it's the Green Book, Richardson. Pliny Trajan Correspondence, CP, that's from the course packet. And so you'll be able to see your readings. And again, these are the readings that you'll do before that very first weekend. Since you'll be doing quite a bit of reading before we meet, before I've even been able to fully introduce the course and introduce all the information that you'll need, I've put together a reading guide, and this will help you. So I've put together a reading guide, looks like this. You'll find it on Moodle also. And what I've done is give just a little bit of background about each reading with suggestions of what to focus on, what to pay attention to. I've put those there to kind of help you know, okay, how do I approach this text when I haven't even started, we haven't even had our first class to introduce all this material, and that should help you work through the material. And I have the suggestions of things to pay attention to. You don't need to turn any kind of reading log or response into me about the reading. So those questions are for your benefit. So take notes in whatever way will be helpful to you. And as you look through the syllabus, you'll be able to see the themes for the course. We're going to begin with our first weekend, which is basically Unit 1. We'll look at the development of early Christianity in its Roman context, kind of seeing how Christianity grows up with these Roman roots. The second weekend will sample theological developments. We'll pay attention not only to how beliefs and doctrine are articulated, but also the conflicts that often lead to that articulation of a particular belief or set of beliefs, particularly in the creed. But we'll also be paying attention to the ecclesial process and structure that's addressing or that's developing in order to address challenges and unorthodox points of view. That third weekend, we'll consider the flourishing of Christian life and expression. You can think of this as how theology comes to life in the life and practices of early Christians. Okay, I'm ready to shift gears now with that background in mind and to talk about a little bit of the context of the Roman Empire and the map, the geography of the Roman Empire. So you can find that map on our Moodle page, and so this would be a good time to pause the video if you need to find that map, or if you're thinking I need to hit the pause button and come back and finish the video at another time. This would be a good stopping point. And my map, I think, let me make sure it's up here. A lot of my materials just fell, and I'm not seeing my map. Hold on one second. Some of my materials just fell on the floor, and so I've got them kind of jumbled up. So now I've got my map as well. So you can find this map on the Moodle website, and it might be just helpful for you to visualize something of the empire. Okay, so hopefully you found your map or had your break. If you wanted to hit a pause, take a pause. And so now let's talk a little bit about the early context of the Roman Empire. Our study in this course is a historical study with theological dimensions. Okay, so I think that sometimes people are like, well, what should I expect from this course? It is a history course, but we're paying attention to theological dimensions, really kind of having the horizon of church life in mind as we go. Our method will be to study events and developments in context. You might want to write that down if you keep thinking, well, what are we about here? We're going to study events and developments in context. We want to discover the story behind a text or event. We'll try to get into the minds of early Christians as much as possible to see the world and to see faith through their eyes as much as we can. We recognize we're seeing things from the vantage point of the 21st century, our own experiences, our own culture, but as much as possible, learn something about their worldview so that we can get a sense of how they were understanding their life of faith. We'll ask not only what happened, but why. Why then? Why there? And context will be important, especially the context of the Roman Empire. So for those of you, I've learned there are people who have history phobia, apparently. And sometimes people, when they come to this class, they're very anxious because they think the class is going to be memorizing a lot of dates and names and places. That's not the sum total of history. So if that's your concern, you can relax a little bit, because if you go back to what I had suggested you write down, our method will be to study events and developments in context. We're paying attention to this story. We need to know certain dates, certain names, certain places in order to kind of understand that context. But we're looking at what's developing. What do those dates and names and places mean? And then how our questions will be historical, but we can't help but think of how does that shape us today. So you have that chapter in your course packet that'll be one of your very first pieces that you read from a Western Civilization book by Tom Noble and others. And this chapter is going to talk about the rise of the Roman Empire. I'll just tell you just a tiny bit of Roman history before the empire, though. Before there was the empire, there was the Roman Republic. It was centered in what today would be Italy. So you can guess it really started with the city-state of Rome, and then their sphere of influence spread to what we would now think of as, most of it would be primarily Italy. But then the Republic would conquer other regions, other kingdoms, and gradually add more and more territory. And so you go from this area around Rome in Italy to having quite a bit of territory that goes all the way around the Mediterranean eventually. As the Republic would conquer some new region, this territory would get added into its system. We might think of it in that way. The areas outside of Italy that got added to the sphere of influence, got added to the reign of the Republic, those new territories would be called provinces. And each province would have a metropolitan city, somewhat like a capital city for that province. And so you have the city-state of Rome that expands until you have the Republic of Rome, which would be pretty much present-day Italy, but then these new areas would be added. They would be provinces. So you'll be reading in this chapter from Noble that Octavian defeated his enemies and consolidated a lot of this territory that had been conquered, consolidated it together under his rule, and that's what becomes the Roman Empire. Octavian's name will be changed, or really he's given titles, but then we'll know him as Augustus Caesar. And so that's what you'll read about in Noble. When Octavian becomes Augustus Caesar and becomes the first Roman Empire. And so some vocabulary that'll help you in thinking about the structure of the empire. First of all, keeping in mind this Roman Republic, which will be centered in Rome, in that area, the territory in Italy. When it was a republic, the Roman Senate led that republic. So the senators would have the authority, they would have the rule, they would have the power and control. The senators were selected from the elders of families that were known as senatorial families. So it was kind of like you inherited the right to serve as the right and responsibility to serve as a senator. And then the elder members of those families, the senatorial families, would be the rulers of this republic. For the most part, those senatorial families were descendants of the first leaders, or sometimes a family would be granted status because of service rendered to the republic, and so then they would become a senatorial family. Well, that was when it was a republic. But now, when it becomes an empire, and you have an emperor, one of the things that Octavian will have to figure out is how am I going to navigate this power of balance? Because the senators are going to expect to have leadership, but yet I'm now in charge. How am I going to do this in a way that keeps them satisfied so they won't rebel against me, but yet I'm actually leading here? So what he does is keep the Senate together as kind of an advisory board, gave them a sense of buy-in with what he was doing, and they advised him on matters related to Italy and then the provinces as well. Let's talk a moment about those provinces. Your map doesn't show the breakdown of the different provinces, but I'll have a map in our classroom where we'll be able to see the provinces. These would be administrative units for that empire. And again, the provinces are the territories outside of Italy. You can think of it as the territory that got added into the republic. The provinces would have a governor. One of the privileges that the Senate would have would be to appoint many of those governors. And a lot of times they would choose people from the noble families there in Rome. The emperor, though, reserved the right to appoint governors in certain provinces, especially those along the border, those that were quite a distance from Rome. Now think about it. Why would the emperor want to, you might think, oh, the emperor would want to appoint the governors for the provinces closest to Rome. But he's paying attention to what's on the outskirts, because those are the areas that are at the most distant from the emperor. It's harder for him to keep an eye on what's happening there. Along the border is where you might have your invasions. If there's going to be an uprising, it might be more likely to be on the border rather than close into Rome, unless it's the senators themselves turning against the emperor. So the emperor would have a vested interest in ensuring that, especially along the border areas, that you have strong governors who are loyal to the emperor. So those would be referred to as imperial provinces. Imperial because the emperor appoints that governor. The others would be known as senatorial provinces. Senatorial because the Senate appoints their governors. And again, the governor would be would be located there in the metropolitan city. So that's some background. We're not going to dive into all the details of who was governor and who did this and who did that, because we'd be turning to the church history, but it's important to know that terminology because it'll come up in some of our reading, but then also to have a sense of, hey, the church is developing in this empire that's developed that's divided into provinces. But the language of provinces and metropolitan cities or metropolitan sees, you might see, oh, wait a minute, this is part of the inspiration for the structure that we have for the church today with our Episcopal model with bishops, and certain bishops are metropolitan bishops or archbishops, and then the bishops in that region grouped together in provinces. Let's talk about some specific places here in the empire, and I'll show you some of the places on the map. I've got some key cities down here. I'll give you a little information now, and we'll meet up with these cities along the way in our study. First of all, we want to start with the Mediterranean Sea, right here in the middle. I used to think, oh, isn't it cool how this map is centered and you have this Mediterranean Sea in the middle? Then as I started doing more and more study of the empire in order to understand the history of the church, I started to see, oh, it's no accident. It's not just like, oh, isn't this interesting? You have this kind of swath of territory that goes in this circle. Because once I read a book where the writer described the Mediterranean Sea as the superhighway of the empire. I love that. I didn't write down the reference, otherwise I would tell you where that information came from. But it's not my idea. But the superhighway of the empire. It's no accident that the empire grew up around a body of water, because this body of water becomes its main transportation route, just like our interstates today, to carry people from one area to another. It became a major trade route for these areas right around the Mediterranean. It became a way that soldiers could kind of come in on a ship and attack a port city in that way. And so that's a major route. It's a major hub. The sea is not simply kind of a beach resort. In fact, a lot of people were afraid of the sea. It was seen as a place of evil early on, because it could be dangerous when storms came up and you were tossed about in your wooden boat out there. So when I think Mediterranean Sea, I think of beautiful beaches, but for them, the Mediterranean was their transportation route. It was a risky transportation route, but it was their route nonetheless. Now, if the Mediterranean Sea is your superhighway, that means your port cities are going to become major cities. They're going to be places of cultural exchange, places of trade. And so certain cities will have prestige because they're port cities. But before we turn to the port cities, let's start with Jerusalem. You can find Jerusalem over here on the eastern side of the Mediterranean Sea. Jerusalem, of course, the capital of ancient Israel, and the birthplace of the church is what I associate with Jerusalem when I'm thinking about early church material. The history of this area around Jerusalem is a history of conflict, a history of conflict over who controls the land, a history of conquest as Israel is conquered by different empires. That's the history that's going through much of the Old Testament, and then the prophets are writing at a time, sometimes, for example, of exile, bringing hope to people. And so a place where the territory keeps changing hands. So for the time period of our study, the province there, at first it's going to be a client kingdom, but then it's going to become a province of the empire, and the name of that province is going to change from time to time. Sometimes it's referred to as Palestine. That's the Romans are naming it as the province of Palestine. It'll get included in the province of Syria at one point. Early on, it's referred to as Judea because it's the client kingdom of the province. So if you want to write down some of this history, it's a client kingdom under Augustus Caesar, and it's a client kingdom known as Judea. That's up until 6 AD. Then it becomes a province of Judea, and this is when there's a harsh rule, and the Jews are tired of being occupied, having Israel be an occupied territory, and they kind of have some uprisings, and then the emperors are harshly putting down the uprisings and eventually destroy the temple. And so finally, Jerusalem is going to basically be annihilated in 135 and rebuilt as a Roman city. Aelia would be the Roman city. And then the province will get renamed Palestine as a kind of way of saying your history is wiped away. You're Palestine now. But then sometimes it'll be referred to as Syro-Palestine or Syria-Palestine because it's a tiny province, and so it'll be associated with Syria, the province of Syria right above. So it's a very, very brief history of kind of the changing of names and hands in that area. But I say all of that because at times we'll see in our writings, or I might refer to the province of Palestine, and I want to make clear I'm using the language of what would have been the language there in that early church time. I'm not making any statement about what should or shouldn't be the name or the kind of government of the Holy Land today. So anytime I use that language of Palestine, I'm not trying to speak about contemporary politics. I'm speaking from the perspective of the particular time period that we're in. So if you hear the word Palestine, it's in that context. Okay, so the birthplace of the church in Jerusalem, but of course the missionaries take the good news all around the empire and actually even outside of the empire. We're going to focus on the history within the empire, but there are missionaries who go off to the east, to the area of ancient Persia into what's present-day India. Our focus will be this imperial region. And the gospel certainly spreads around that region, and it reaches all the way into Rome. Rome, here in Italy. Rome, of course, is the center of power for the empire up until the mid-3rd century. Then we're going to see the capital move. But until the mid-3rd century, center of power for the empire, and some of the early missionary movements will reach there as well. And so the church in Rome is associated with two apostles, both Peter and Paul, associated with Rome. Both are martyred there. Their tombs are there. And so it also becomes a pilgrimage site early on for those who are able to travel to go on pilgrimage to visit the tombs of Saints Peter and Paul. So I often think of Rome as a double apostolic see because you have those two apostles, Peter and Paul, associated with it. You have Alexandria down here in Egypt, a port city there on the Mediterranean. Alexandria is often thought of as the number 2 city of the empire. It's a great cultural city. It's a major port. There's a lot of interreligious interaction taking place there as many Jews had migrated into that area. You have lots of philosophical schools there associated with various pagan practices. And when I use the term pagan in this class, I'm not using it in a pejorative. It's going to take a pejorative sense later. That's the language that the Christians would have used for their neighbors, and there is a pejorative sense in the way they're using it, but it comes to be used for those polytheistic religions that are the traditional religions of the area. So sometimes when I say pagan, people are like, wait, what do you mean when you say pagan? Because it has many layers of meaning. I'm simply using it to refer to those traditional religions of the area. And so you have many pagan philosophers. They're in the schools in Alexandria, and they're meeting up with Jews, and then Christianity spreads there in the 2nd century as well. And so a lot of dialogue and exchange and conversation among various philosophers about these different religions. Antioch would be the number 3 city of the empire. There'll be several cities that get the name of Antioch, but if you look north of Jerusalem on our map, that's the Antioch that we'll have in mind when we refer to Antioch. It's in the province of Syria. Right now at the present-day border, it's right along that border with Turkey today. And in fact, I think it technically would be on the Turkish side of the border there, but it's the province of Syria. So number 3 city of the empire. It's also a major port. The followers of Christ were first called Christians here. You can find that in the book of Acts of the Apostles. I've often wondered, is that a compliment like, oh, we can see how you follow this man Jesus? Or is it a little bit of a mocking? Oh, these are the people that follow this man that died on a cross. For those who don't recognize Christ as the Son of God, these are the ones that follow that man that died on a cross, and they say he rose again. We don't know what that's about, but let's call them Christians, maybe as a way of having fun. I don't know. I've asked different people, and there are different theories about why the name began to be used. But the first reference we have to the followers of Christ being called Christians would be there in Antioch. I'm going to continue circle around the Mediterranean. Speaking of philosophy, let's go to Athens. Athens would be the kind of the leader in ancient Greece. The province there under the Romans would be Achaia, not Ikea, Achaia, spelled Achaea. And we're not going to spend much time talking about Athens, but I want to be sure that you have that kind of on your radar, that it's there. And still many philosophical schools there during the time of early Christianity, but there's not a lot of political power there in Athens within the empire. While we're in that region, let's look north, a little northeast of Athens, and you'll see Constantinople. Constantinople will be built in the 4th century. It's the ancient city of Byzantium. It's going to be rebuilt by Constantine, named for him, become his capital, Constantinople. So we'll meet up with Constantinople in the 4th century. And you can see around Constantinople you have Nicaea and Nicomedia. We'll meet up with those in the 4th century as well. While we're up there, you can see the Black Sea. That's the body of water just north of Constantinople. When you read the correspondence of Pliny and Trajan for this first weekend, Pliny will be the governor in Bithynia and Pontus, which is the province right along the Black Sea. So you can imagine Pliny up there along the Black Sea. Now let's head west. Let's go over to Italy. You see Milan, north of Rome. It's in Italy. Italy's not a province, but I just want to be sure you know where Milan is. We'll meet up with Milan in the 4th century as well. It's going to become a capital for a brief time. And what else do we need to look at over here? We can go down to North Africa. If you go south of Rome, you see Hippo, Carthage. Carthage would be a major port city for this province that is known as Africa in the ancient world. I'll usually refer to it as North Africa to help us think in terms of the province rather than the continent. And so Africa would be the province right around Carthage. I'm looking to see if I have skipped over anything else that we need to look at. I think that covers all of our major places to pay attention to at this point. Oh, no, Cappadocia. We should go back to Cappadocia. Go back east. This area here, that's present-day Turkey, that area is called Asia Minor. And Cappadocia would be the province right around Caesarea, there in the middle of Asia Minor. And so the province right around would be Cappadocia. We're not going to spend much time with the Cappadocians, but we'll see references to the great Cappadocian writers in the 4th century, such as Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory Nazianzus. They're all from that area of that province of Cappadocia. So that's the map. You might find it helpful to have that map nearby so as you're reading and there are references to different places, you can keep straight in your mind where the different places are. Also on Moodle, I've put together kind of a summary timeline that might help you just to kind of think of the order of events. It's on Moodle, it's just there as a reference. We're not really going to do anything with that timeline, but you might find it useful to have it there. So this gives you some orientation as you begin your study. Your task now, between now and our first class, will be to do the reading for that first weekend. So you have all that information on the syllabus, you have your reading guide to help you, and I, of course, will be happy to have conversation with you if you need to get in touch with me by phone or email in advance of the course if you need any clarification. But hopefully everything, you've got plenty of materials to give you a guidance and you'll be ready to get started on your own, and then we'll meet up at the end of January. I look forward to meeting all of you then and for our interaction and conversation. In the meantime, I wish you all of the best, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.